I'm going to tell you two stories about my vocation, one public story and one private story. One I would dare to write a book about, and one I am even a little scared to talk about in this room. And I want to tell you both stories because both are important to the real work of being a leader. And if we're honest, social entrepreneurship involves not only starting an organization that does important and life-changing work, but also crafting a life outside of that work that will sustain you. Okay, so story one, starting Bloodwater. If I look at it today from this vantage point, Bloodwater is a remarkable story. 1 million people with clean water, $28 million raised, 4 HIV clinics serving thousands of patients, tens of thousands of American supporters, 10 staff, 11 countries, 12 years of operation. But had you invited me here right out of college, I would have told you a different story about failure and doubt. If you look at the amount of time that it takes for corn to grow in Africa, or for a girl to walk with her bucket to the nearest watering hole, you find that the pace of life and the growth of people follow the pace and growth of the land. Or if you're witness to the achievement of a community coming together to build its own rainwater catchment tank, only to be followed by an unexpected season of drought, you begin to expect a slow-paced and uneven path in all things. And my life as a social entrepreneur and as a faithful member of my family has also followed that same course. In Kenya, they say pole pole, or slowly by slowly. In Zambia, they say panono panono, brick by brick. And they're not referring to just speed or pace, but also that uneven up and down, 3 steps forward, 2 steps back nature of both work and life amidst challenging circumstances and broken relationships and deep-set cultural constraints. There's never an expectation that life will go smoothly or that you will reach your destination with expediency. Slowly by slowly expects ebb and flow. It sees healthcare happening in the midst of overwhelming sickness. It brings 10,000 liters of water, even if 100,000 are needed. Brick by brick, there are hospital wings and freshwater wells, and yet millions more women continue to walk miles for water. Slowly by slowly, we expect to wage the long defeat and seek after the new heavens in the midst of a nearly blinding brokenness. I spent my college years at Whitworth University in Spokane, Washington as an AIDS activist. I had failed as a nursing major due to too many embarrassing moments of passing out at the sight of blood and needles. But before I switched majors, I had learned about the devastating effects of HIV on the body. And later, I learned about its astounding impact on communities around the world, and particularly in sub-Saharan Africa. In my senior year, while leading a campus chapter of the Student Global AIDS campaign, I spent more days out of the classroom than in it, attending conferences and rallies and advocacy meetings. And it was at the Faces of Justice conference in Phoenix where I met Steve Garber, who many of you know because of his deep ties to Jubilee. And through Steve, I had the opportunity to meet the members of the band Jars of Clay. And they, a couple months later, were coming to play on my campus. The band had just begun their own conversations about 2 significant challenges in Africa, the HIV/AIDS pandemic and the water crisis. And they dreamt of starting their own organization that would engage their audience in issues of clean blood and clean water in Africa by the name of Bloodwater. I heard their vision for this, and as we walked through the campus together, I became excited about how this mission could be a powerful vehicle for love and change in the world. So I wrote them a 25-page proposal on how I thought they could start their organization and somehow convince the band that an eager and committed college student was exactly what they needed to start their nonprofit. And they let me try. So as soon as I graduated from college, I packed my car and drove across the country to Nashville, not entirely sure where that actually was, and began the next chapter of my life. It was both exciting and terrifying. Because even though I had what many people might have considered a dream scenario, where I graduated knowing my destination and what I was tasked with, beyond that, I knew nothing else. I had established an incredible life and community and identity in college, and then I had to leave it. I picked up and moved to Tennessee and was completely disoriented about where I was and certainly confused about who I was. There was no manual for making such a transition, nor for starting Bloodwater and its first major campaign, the 1,000 Wells Project, a lofty goal to provide 1,000 communities in Africa with access to safe water. I didn't have a place to live. I was not being paid. I had no financial capital to start the organization, and outside of the band, I knew no one in Nashville. So after my triumphal exit from college, I began my first task in a musty room in the basement of an old church, furnished with an overused table and metal folding chair like the ones you see in old cafeterias. I stared at my computer, and sometimes I just stared at the wall as I considered the task in front of me. I worked alone in that office until it got dark and showed up each night in a new place with a small duffel bag hanging over my shoulder. One night, a guest bedroom. One night, a dorm room at a local university. One night, a tour bus with the band. And many, many nights in tears. It was a slowly by slowly experience. And while my classmates might have looked at me with envy on graduation day, they didn't know and I didn't know that I would spend my first months of glory as a college graduate wondering if I had made some grand mistake. But I pressed on, slowly by slowly. Entrepreneurship isn't just about having the biggest ideas. I think it's also about being able to build from the small. And the dream for the 1,000 Wells Project began with $1. Our simple math was that $1 would provide a year of water for someone in Africa. So during concerts, we started asking for $1 at a time. And every time I returned from a concert, I went straight to our post office box to see if anyone was responding to our invitation. Online donations were not mainstream yet, so the majority of donations would come in the form of checks through the mail. You have to remember, this is going to make me sound old or feel old, but this was before there was Facebook or even such a thing as online crowdfunding. So many times that box was empty. And sometimes there were a few dollars in there, or a check for $30 or $50, and I would open the envelopes in my car like Charlie Bucket, unwrapping his chocolate bars, hoping to find that golden ticket. But there was no such thing. And our recently assembled board of directors came together to discuss our intended launch of this 1,000 Wells project. Dan from Jars of Clay was adamant that the fundraising work of Bloodwater be accessible to kids and teenagers and college students and families. We had an idea for a fundraising model. In villages all over Africa, community groups aggregate small donations to address some of the needs of a member in the group. Perhaps someone is facing a poor harvest, has a sickness in the family, or has a child entering high school. The group members each contribute a small amount to benefit the welfare of the other. In Swahili, this is called Harambee, a time when everyone in a community comes together, those with status, those without status, those with much and those with little, to contribute whatever they have to a collective cause. It's as much about one's participation in that communal act of giving as it is in the amount that any one person gives. The point is that we all give together because we all share our burdens together. And I have since seen elderly widows bring 2 ears of corn to a church Harambee, and the corn auctioned off for a few coins toward that collection basket. And despite some hesitations about whether it would yield results, the board signed off on this grassroots fundraising strategy. Then, as if led by the spirit of communal giving themselves, the members threw a sort of Harambee to raise the small capital to cover basic costs and provide me with a living stipend so I could move into an apartment. Each board member and band member committed to bringing in $1,000 each within 30 days, whether from their own pockets or through friends, family, and other connections. And that's how Bloodwater's first donors included my parents, the band's close family friends, the band's studio producer, and my college professors. And over time, this dollar-by-dollar approach became infectious. A woman gave up her plans of improving her home sprinkler system and instead donated the money for a well. 10-year-olds sent in wads of dollar bills and coins from their neighborhood lemonade stands. Nashville-based musicians took the message on the road and passed buckets at their own shows, bringing in thousands more dollars. People of means contributed what they could, and checks for $1,000 and $5,000 joined the collection. People of influence and wisdom volunteered their time as advisors and joined our board. A group of 20-somethings rode their bikes across the country and raised money in every city they stopped in. The band's recording label donated its staff and supplies to creating promotional materials for the launch of 1,000 Wells. We were living out Harambe. And we officially launched the 1,000 Wells project in February of 2005, coinciding with the band's 20-city spring tour across the country. It had been nearly 18 months since the band and I met on my college campus with little more than an idea. By the time we hit the road, we had customized an experience for each show that included videos and stories and opportunities to give. We had built our values, developed partnerships ready for work in Africa, assembled a body of volunteers, and committed to a mission statement. These actions were like prayers for us. And at the end of each show, Dan made his ask, and then the volunteers and I circulated with buckets. After the concert, we piled into the bus and poured the wads of cash across the back table. Each night, each city, we opened dollar bills that translated into water for thousands of Africans. Whether they were crisp or sticky or torn, we unfolded each one as if it were a love letter. We came to believe that we were rescuing dollars that would probably have been spent on things like coffee or some form of entertainment. At least that's what we would have spent them on. But just as our African brothers and sisters needed to be rescued from the injustices of the AIDS and water crises, our American brothers and sisters and their money needed to be rescued from the trivial wants and worries. Through giving, people like us were seeing ourselves differently, seeing our lives differently. Generosity has a redemptive nature. It is a dual rescue. And within our first 3 months of launching the 1,000 Wells project, we had brought in $20,000. And then our Harambe took on a national scale. I received a call from a Christian radio station based in Sacramento. K-Love Radio had 5 million listeners across the country, and they wanted to help. They hosted annual telethons on behalf of a designated charity, bringing in as much as $50,000 in one day through small donations. I couldn't imagine what that would mean for us to raise that kind of amount of money in such a small amount of time. So the band and I told stories of our friends in Africa for 20 on-air hours. K-Love's listeners joined that giving circle. In one day, we brought in $250,000 for the 1,000 Wells project, and we couldn't believe it. I flew back to Nashville a couple of days later on an evening flight, completely overwhelmed. At midnight, as per usual, I pulled into the post office parking lot and walked into the well-lit hallway. I turned the key to our box, as I did every day that I was in town, but the lock resisted. I jiggled it a bit and yanked at that metal door until it opened, and piles of envelopes fell at my feet, and I broke into tears. That once barren mailbox was overflowing with letters from hundreds of people across the country who had heard us on the radio. I slid my back down against the wall and sat on the floor of that vacant hallway, opening one envelope and then another. Checks for $20, checks for $1,000, 50,000 additional dollars for Africa at my feet. Our grassroots approach in the U.S. was working. We were gathering at concerts and on campuses, at churches and online. We were gathering on our bikes and over lemonade stands and in our cars with the radio playing. Like our friends in Africa, we were aggregating small donations to address some of the needs of our neighbors. We were giving together. And so the world bent, and I leaned into it with joy. And over the years, that $1 became $20 and $100, and today, more than $28 million. And we achieved the 1,000 Wells Project. We have served more than 1 million people in Africa with clean water, and we are on a mission to serve 1 million more. But we had, and will continue to have, countless hiccups along the way. For all the triumphs, there have been failures, disappointment, and utter disillusionment. I have had to end funding relationships in Africa because of deceit. I have had to fire friends and early staff for their inability to grow beyond our startup. I've had to back out of promises made to African partners because of global recessions that halted generosity. And I have had to ask for sacrifices from my friends and family that only later did I realize were not worth it. And I have watched my own good intentions fail to rival a world embedded with injustice. But, pole pole, panono panono, I have stuck with this for more than a decade. I have chosen to love the work and the world even when I don't feel like it. And I'm glad that I have. Okay, story number 2. Learning to love and lead at the same time. This slowly by slowly approach that I so deeply believe in applies not just to the social entrepreneur's venture, but also to the social entrepreneur herself. In the midst of the 1,000 Wells campaign and traveling to see the work of Bloodwater in Kenya, I met a man who was equally devoted to this slowly by slowly approach. And when I say that I met a man while traveling, James and I actually met on a plane to Kenya. Those things do happen. And we fell in love quickly, married quickly, and have been happily married for 8 years. And for almost all of those years, James has been leading a separate organization focused on health and development in Western Kenya. With 2 executive directors under one roof, it's a crowded house. Imagine 2 mission-driven people, each with annual budgets to raise, a board to build, staff to lead, trying to go to bed at night. It has required a lot of creativity to manage our calendars, as we both go to Africa 4 times a year, but to different locations and on different timelines. In the last 5 years, James was averaging over 100 days a year in this small village where he serves. James and I were also carrying significant weight with our respective nonprofits because we were working on issues of life and death, and at times for each of us, the death overwhelmed the celebrations of life. We have both lost colleagues to AIDS and road accidents. We have seen community projects fail and people cheat their neighbors. We have each had seasons with tight budgets that seemed insurmountable, and they were not the same seasons. It was challenging, but it gave us a keen sense of mutual identity. Within our Nashville community, we were that couple that was known for our work in Africa. And about 2 years ago, when we had our son Jude, this whole arrangement became completely unsustainable. I remember returning from 3 months of maternity leave to go back to work at Bloodwater and being undone. Like many new moms who work, there was the rushing out in the mornings and back again in the evenings, the pumping and storing of milk, the coordinating with babysitters. But we had the additional challenges of international travel and leading growing organizations and keeping the donations flowing. And as we tried to get back on our leadership tracks, our commitments to each other and to our new family and our own community began to fall apart. There were very little fruits of the Spirit coming out of the Nardella household. Instead, we bore stress, anger, fear, exhaustion, resentment, excuses, and an unending outsourcing of our lives. While we were on a mission to provide wholeness of life and community development across Africa, we were not actually living those out for ourselves. I looked at James and waved my proverbial white flag, wishing the world would stop for a moment so we could catch our breath and look each other in the eye and ask what just happened to our lives. But we knew that the world wasn't going to stop on our behalf. And so in a moment of clarity and desperation, we deliberately stepped out of our world for a week and took a time out. The next morning, we hopped on a plane, and James's parents graciously welcomed us into their San Diego home. His parents took care of Jude, while James and I tried to get a minute together. There's a beautiful poem called The Clearing, and it says, "Do not try to serve the whole world or do anything grandiose. Instead, create a clearing in the dense forest of your life and wait there patiently until the song that is yours alone to sing falls into your open-cupped hands and you recognize and greet it. Only then will you know how to give yourself to the world so worthy of rescue." And in our attempts to continue to give our whole selves to the world, to the life-saving work of both of our missions, we were a hot mess. Because there was no waiting patiently or letting some song fall into our open-cupped hands. We had become martyrs, or at least we displayed strong symptoms of missionalism, which is a milder case of martyrdom. And James and I spent the week revisiting the values that we set forth on our wedding day that have been a compass for us in times such as these. Being the strategic executives that we are, we graphed Venn diagrams of our values and tried to understand where we are and where we want to be. Our marriage values include community, spirituality, intimacy, originality, faithfulness, honesty, service, and fun. Fun? We looked at each other, baffled that we would have named such a value for our marriage. Service was the only one that we were knocking out of the park. The rest of this list looked like the weeds of forgotten virtues, dwindling in some unwatered flower bed behind our house. And we did not, of course, solve all our problems in 1 week together. But something opened up between the two of us. Perhaps a slight clearing that ushered something that resembled peace and wisdom. So we paid attention to it, and we prayed for it. And we knew we needed to pace ourselves, to be willing to live differently, even if that put us at odds with the status quo or looked like a detour from our important work. It's a longer story than I have time to offer you here. But within 12 months of our time out in San Diego, with our marriage values as our compass, James and I have both stepped down from the executive director roles that we have held. And we have, as graciously as we can, handed our organizations to others to steward and care for in this next season. Last September, the same week I released a book about my entrepreneurial work with Bloodwater, we packed our things and left our Nashville community and moved west to the Bay Area to be near our families as we raise our own. James accepted a good job at a Palo Alto-based foundation where he supports the work of other social entrepreneurs around the world. And now I am serving on the board of Bloodwater and also spending 20 hours a week advising other social entrepreneurs as they build their organizations. It is a different season with much less intensity. We have this hope that by choosing a new location in proximity to family and the beautiful outdoors and occupations that won't occupy the whole of us, we will remember who and whose we are. We hope to rebuild the muscles of whole personhood that have atrophied over the years. We hope our marriage can find its way back to adventure and romance amid the diapers and logistics of toddlerhood. And that by having a season of Sabbath and parenting, we will be rejuvenated, ready to take on the next big, audacious goal. God has invited us into a brick-by-brick kingdom, and it means that none of us are to be saviors here, but simply faithful to that which we have been given. Entrepreneurship celebrates the startup and the new idea and the fresh energy, but it also ought to accept the seasons when the fruits have fallen and the branches need rest before blossoming again. Strangely enough, I believe that I will have greater impact on the HIV/AIDS and water crisis in Africa by pacing myself now rather than continuing to try to bull forward in the same manner that I have for the last 12 years. Because I have a lot more work I want to contribute to the world, but I want to do it with my family by my side. With James and I fully in love and fully aligned together 10 years from now. And Lord willing, 20 years, 30 years, 40 years from now. So in the beauty and the grief of it all, my message is the same, slowly by slowly. Thank you.